Thank you all so much for being here this morning. I'm feeling really grateful to have the opportunity to share some things that I think are really important to be thinking about and talking about. So thank you for being here with me. I want to tell a story about what it means to be alive in the Anthropocene, right? So the Anthropocene is the current age that we're living in, right? And it's called that because it denotes the huge impact that humans are having on the whole planet, so much so that it's actually a new geological age. So I think that as we're thinking about what it means to be a parent nowadays, what it means to be raising children nowadays, what it means to be thinking about what our responsibilities are for the coming generations, that this sort of broader context is really important. So I'm going to be telling a story today about that context, which will frame a discussion about what kinds of schools we should have, what kinds of things we should be thinking about when we're raising our children. And we'll take it from there. But in order to sort of get to that, I sort of want to lay out a story first. So first, just in terms of framework, we're living in a world where we can sort of see on the horizon some potential problems, right? And we, as adults, are going to have to find a way to deal with that. And ultimately, our children are going to have to deal with that. So what we see when we look at socioeconomic trends and Earth system trends, we see a lot of exponential growth curves that cannot continue indefinitely, right? So we're going to have to reckon with that at some point. We've expended more energy in the 20th century than in all previous history. The population has grown by a factor of 10 in less than 200 years. There were less than 1 billion people on the planet 200 years ago. So we're at the point where we are exceeding the carrying capacity of the planet, and we're going to need global solutions, right? So any conversation we're going to have about education should be in that context. How are our children going to be ready to actually enact global solutions and to have a global awareness of the world that they're living in and the problems that are facing them? So that's a snapshot of today, but it's also important for us to be thinking about the future, right, and what lies ahead on the horizon. Because it's actually not our job to prepare children for the world as it is, because the future is looking like it could be radically different. So we're staring right now at what could be called the fourth industrial revolution, where we're looking at the potential implications of artificial intelligence, the Internet of Things, blockchain technology, nanotechnology, quantum computing, 5G wireless, 3D printing, applied genetics and genetic engineering, fully autonomous vehicles, decentralized sustainable energy, and the automation of most current jobs, right? So that's part of the context too, in that much of educational thinking has been geared toward getting a job, but the entire landscape of what that even means is going to change. Therefore, education should be aware of that and should be changing as well. It seems as though we're potentially entering a big phase shift, and we need to be prepared for what that entails. And we need to understand that the larger context in which these technologies are emerging are really what we need to be thinking about. Not just what's happening, but how will they be organized and coordinated, right? So we live in a world right now where big tech platforms have a tremendous amount of power, where nation states, which really relied on sort of broadcast, centralized communication, now we live in a very decentralized world where people are getting information from all different sources. So how do we actually cohere like a coherent narrative for our children to really understand the world that they're coming into and to be able to face these challenges? I think that it's potential that digital technology could be really liberating. So we need to, of course, be thinking about how to utilize technology to help solve some of our problems. But the reality is that right now, what we're looking at is technology that's been born through and taken over by a sort of centralized economic logic that has been dominating for the last couple hundred years. So the logic that's animating and utilizing technology is going to have to change, right? So the next generation is going to be the generation that's going to have to make some big shifts in terms of our relationship to the technologies that are emerging. So we need to take seriously the direction that we're heading in, and we need to take responsibility for the world that we're leaving our children. So these are things that as parents, as citizens, we have to think about. We can't just be thinking about parenting practices and what schools our children go to and what grades they're going to get and what college they're going to go to, because it's bigger than that. The context that they're living in is bigger than that. So this world of wicked problems, right? This world of volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity, it's a world where the problems are not just out there, like we have to look at ourselves and think about the relationships between what's happening in the world and our ways of thinking and our ways of understanding the world, so that we can think about what are the ways of thinking and understanding that our children are going to have if they're actually going to get some traction in making things better. Because complexity requires competence, right? So one way of thinking about what's happening right now is that our capacity to make sense of information is not increasing at the same rate as the complexity of information that we have access to. So we've lost our ability to make sense of our environment. So our number one charge as parents and as educators is helping our kids make sense of the world, right? And again, the media landscape has changed tremendously. The status quo around how you get your information has changed tremendously and is continuing to change. There's a lot of conflicting and competing information out there. We're living in what some people are calling a post-truth world, right? Or a world of truthiness, where it's sort of hard to tell what's really true and what's not. And we see that many people have different perspectives on things. But it's getting harder and harder to really claim any sort of objectivity or claim any sort of truthful, fact-based narrative that this is the real story and ignore those other narratives. So we have to find a way to make sense of that and find some larger overarching frameworks that are going to actually include those diverse voices without denying them, but also don't fall into a sort of relativism where every perspective is equal. So if we're going to actually think about any of these big problems, and if we're going to think about different ways of approaching education and parenting, we actually have to look at the diversity of perspectives themselves and see how they emerged, how they relate to each other, and how we make sense of that diversity. So that's some of what I'm going to be talking about, because we need a narrative, we need a story, right? We need to be able to help our children make sense of the world. So in order to do that, I suggest we actually just take a step back, take a deep breath, drink some water. All right, what is the evolutionary context that shapes us in our world? I think that's an important question. What is our grand narrative, right? And what are the implications of that for how we should be raising and educating our children? So evolution can be looked at in a lot of different ways. One way to think about it is just as the increase of complexity. That's actually one way of thinking about what's been happening for the past 13, 14 billion years, is that organisms have been getting more complex. Networks and relationships amongst what exists has been getting more complex. And that complexity goes hand in hand with an increase in consciousness or subjective experience as well, right? So we see that more complex manifestations are coming into being. And those complex manifestations, like human beings and other animals on Earth, as far as we know, are very aware of what's happening, and we're starting to become aware of evolution itself, right? So everything that we're going to be thinking about is in that context. Because human development is just one aspect of this evolutionary process, right? And education can actually be seen as the process through which we determine how to support and foster and direct the evolution of our species, right? So I think that big frame is actually helpful when we're trying to deal with some of these big picture problems, like the wicked problems of climate crises and economic collapse and the need for global solutions. We need a broader and deeper understanding of this evolutionary context that is able to make sense of different perspectives within that context. Because one thing, too, that we need to be thinking about is how evolution is not just about material things or animals. It's actually about insides and outsides. So like subjective experience is evolving along with objective experience, and what's the relationship between those things? And we can identify directionality and trends that we need to connect to how we're developing as human beings. So I'm suggesting that this could be part of a big story or a grand narrative that can actually weave together different perspectives and kind of be potentially healing and liberating and helpful for humanity as we try to figure out where we've come and where we're going. So as we look through history, thinking about not just in terms of material evolution, but the evolution and the emergence of worldviews, right? So you can see patterns emerging in humanity across time of different ways of looking at the world, different ways of thinking, different ways of organizing society. And we can see some cross-cultural, quasi-universal patterns emerging. So this connects to what a philosopher named Hansi Freinacht calls the great stretching out, where over time we see this stretching out of perspectives and we see different values and different ways of organizing the world, and more keep emerging, but the ones that already emerge still exist in different forms. So it just becomes more and more complicated in terms of navigating these different worldviews and these different structures all at the same time, because they don't go away, they just keep building on each other and changing. And we can also shift between systems of production, size of social groups, and structures of thought. So one way to think about that is as a 4-quadrant framework. I'm sharing this. This was developed by Ken Wilber as part of his integral theory as a way of trying to create a non-reductive meta-theory, so a way of organizing different ideas about what's happening. And I think it's a really crucial insight to see that as we think about how things are changing and developing, that you really can't reduce, for instance, our subjective experience to our objective bodies, right? You can't reduce what's happening in our cultures or our intersubjective we space to our systems of production. Like, none of these aspects of reality are reducible. They all are real. They can all be studied independently, but they all relate to each other in different ways. So when we're thinking about the kind of crises that we're facing, it's sort of a good checkpoint for us to think about, are we taking a holistic sort of integral view on what's happening? Are we thinking about what's happening in terms of our subjectivity and our consciousness? Are we thinking about behavior, systems, and culture, and all these things and how they relate to each other? And what's interesting to see in history is that at different times, sort of different areas of life sort of take precedence or have a big impact on the others. And it seems like right now we are living in an age where we're being pushed down an ever narrower path in response to environmental pressures and technological change. So you could think of this lower right quadrant of systems, which includes technology and social systems, and how that's having a huge impact on our behavior and our thinking and our culture, right? So you can think of it as being sort of out of balance, like what's happening in the exterior world, sort of runaway technology, runaway progress, having economic global structures that nobody really understands or can really control. It's kind of getting out of hand, and our sort of interior evolution is not keeping pace, right? Like, our thinking and our cultural way of making meaning is not really in right relationship with the evolution of our social world. So that is a framework that can be empowering for us in terms of just seeing what needs to happen. We need to bring it back in balance. We need to find a way to actually update our operating systems, update the ways that we make sense and think and perceive and interpret, so that we can actually be in a better relationship to the exterior world and kind of bring it back into harmony, right? So that's a big picture idea there. So another question that arises if we're thinking about these things is, what are the relationships between evolution and human development, right? And then obviously, as we're thinking about human development, that takes us right into thinking about education and parenting. So what are our potentials as adults to keep growing? This framework on the right is based on Piagetian theory, going through basic cognitive structures of development, which many people are familiar with. But it does sort of beg the question, what's next? What are further human potentials? And what's been happening for the past 30, 40, 50 years is many different models are being developed that help explain what the possibilities are for adult human development and for post-formal development, meaning beyond simple, formal, operational, rational, logical thinking. What are the capacities available to us? The better we understand those capacities, the better we understand what the potentials of our children are, the better we can shape educational systems that are actually geared toward helping children to reach those higher potentials, because those are the higher potentials that are going to enable people to actually respond intelligently to the complexity of the social world, right? So all these things can start to come together. As we're thinking about theories of human development, I'm going to go into talking about some aspects of human development. It's really important to keep in mind that all theories are dependent on particular methodologies, particular assessments that are done. So there's many different models, there's many different assessments, there's many different theories that have been developed. What's really interesting is seeing how they overlap and seeing what patterns emerge, and not falling into the trap of thinking that any one theory is really going to explain humanity, and to not fall into a sort of myth of the given as though, well, this is the way it is. So once we understand this, then we understand everything. It's not what I'm suggesting. We're always going to enact different theories based on different data, which is collected through different models and assessments. But what's interesting is that we definitely see patterns emerging across different theorists and theories and assessments and models so that we can see a bigger picture emerging in terms of what's possible. There's different ways to break down stages, there's different ways to characterize stages, but something's happening, right? It's not real just because there are disagreements or there's different ways to think about things. You can still see these broader truths that can weave different perspectives together into a larger framework, which is sort of what I'm aiming for here, is to sketch out what would a sort of broad meta theory be that can bring together lots of different theories and lots of different fields of information to make sense of our world and of ourselves as much as we can. And the more conscious we become, the better our models of understanding of development will become, right? And the more sophisticated our relationship to those models will be, right? So if you take a less complex approach to complexity in human development, you're going to end up with something really destructive like the eugenics movement, right? Or associating development with race, or like making all kinds of mistakes that can happen, right? There's a great book called The Mismeasure of Man by Stephen Jay Gould, which kind of goes through a history of all the terrible ways that we've tried to measure each other and rank each other and create power hierarchies out of pseudo-natural hierarchies, right? But as we're getting to a better place in terms of our research and our own thinking and our society, we can actually develop more sophisticated understandings of development so that we don't fall into those traps, but we also don't fall back on just denying that there is a such thing as development, right? Because that's not helpful either. So we're not talking about kinds of people, we're talking about available perspectives, right? Perspectives that are available to everyone. You could think of them as frequencies or wavelengths or patterns or probabilities of consciousness. We're talking about the structures, styles, and limits of the voices inside our heads, basically, right? And those voices are not us either. Those voices are things that we can identify with, but they're actually being influenced by our environment and our relationships, our families, and our educational systems, right? So that's one way of sort of understanding what's happening. As we grow up and we learn different ways of making sense of the world, we can see this development of human values and symbols emerging over time, both individually and collectively. So there's this unfolding spiral of values and identity. You can think of them as value memes, right? So what we think of as traditional society can be aligned with what is sort of in the middle there, the blue, around order, hierarchy, purpose, rules. That was the foundation of many human societies for the past few thousand years, right? But then a different sort of order of value emerged, which is often identified with modernity and the scientific enlightenment and revolution around rationality, science, progress, right, individualism. And this is largely the legacy that we're living with today. So it's great to be able to identify it and see, oh, okay, this value structure emerged. This has had a huge impact on the Western world and now globally over the past couple hundred years. And we can also see since then, which has really become very present in the past 50 or 60 years, is this more green value structure, right? And it is often thought of as green because it's taking a more systems perspective, thinking about compassion, sensitivity, networking, diversity, a sort of green ecological awareness, a critique of modernity, right? Modernity was a critique of traditional sort of mythological belief and the emergence of science out of mythical religious belief. Postmodernity emerged as a critique of modernity. And what we're seeing now is actually the time is ripe to have thoughtful critiques of postmodernity, right? And thoughtful critiques of this green value meme, because that value structure that has emerged, which we can see in many positive developments in society, is actually not solving the problems of modernity, right? Partly because it's too hung up on a critique of modernity, a critique of progress, a critique of linear rationality. But we need to move beyond critique and get toward actually reconstructing or constructing more positive solutions, right? And not just being stuck up on deconstructing everything. Because where that leaves us, that sort of green value structure that has emerged, which is very fixated on critiquing modernity and, you know, all the disasters that came from modernity, but kind of forgetting the dignities and wonderful things that came from modernity. But it can leave us in this sort of relativistic space, which ties into what I was saying before about how the world that we're living in right now can be thought of as sort of a post-truth world, because it's hard to really know where to put your foot down. We can see the problems and the limits of these different ways of thinking, but it doesn't really leave us with any clear answers. And what we need to figure out is how do we provide clear answers for our children, right? So we all have a meaningful background framework, but we're not always thinking about it. We're not often looking at it because we're too busy looking through it, right? So one of the intentions of a talk like this is just to give us a sense of taking that backward step and becoming metacognitive about how we think about things, how we're structuring reality, how we're interpreting reality, because that's conducive to our own growth and development. Another key point here is that as we're going through the stages, both individually and collectively as a society, ideally we're transcending and including, right? So as we move beyond the limits of traditional society, we still want to include the good things about traditional society, right? Like the importance of connection and relationship, and rules and order are actually very important, right? And healthy hierarchy actually can be very important too. And as we move beyond modernity and we get beyond really destructive forms of capitalism and colonialism and scientific materialism, which has sort of lost the spirituality of life, as we move beyond that, we still want to keep the benefits of scientific thinking, rational thinking, and all that good stuff. Similarly, as we move beyond postmodernity, we want to include how we can now critique systems, critique modernity, have more green values, but not get stuck in a relativistic place where we can't really have a larger narrative, right? One way of thinking about postmodernity is just denying any meta-narratives, right? Like nobody has the right to have a big story anymore. Nobody has the right to say this is the way it is, because you can just look at their positionality and say, oh, well, you're just this person from this place and that's your perspective. So what you're saying really has no relevance to everyone else. And we've got to find a way to get beyond that. And I think taking a bigger picture about how perspectives evolve can help us to do that. So we want to avoid developmental blindness, right? We want to avoid going through life not acknowledging the ways that development really has a huge impact. It's not the only thing going on. There are so many psychological, emotional, cultural, social influences on our world. But if we actually have a pretty coherent developmental frame, it really does help us explain a lot of what's going on in the world, so we don't want to deny that or lose that. So these are models from Kurt Fisher and Michael Commons, both who worked out of Harvard, both who looked at different ways at the development of complexity, right? So this is one way of thinking that I think is crucial for thinking about education and parenting, because one of the things that we want to be doing is developing the complexity of our children's thinking, right? And that should be really the cornerstone of the educational process, is how are we moving children through these stages so that they're becoming more conscious and more complex as they get older, and not getting stuck, right? And not having arrested development based on thinking the way that their parents think or their peers think or mainstream society thinks, right? We want to move them through in as healthy a way as we can, as far as they can, so that they can be the system changers and system transformers of the future. So if we're thinking about cognitive complexity, we're thinking about an equilibrium of behavior, right? We're thinking about a form of behavior within a range of complexity in relation to an environment. So you move from constructing stories of sort of concrete facts at the concrete stage, to then finding abstract variables in those stories, to finding formal relationships between those variables, to then finding systems of relationships at the systematic level, to then finding common properties of different systems at the metasystematic level, to then developing paradigms that explain the principles across the relationships of systems, right? So it just keeps getting more and more complex, but by including the previous stage. So it is a natural hierarchy. It's a growth hierarchy. It's not necessarily a moral hierarchy. It's not better or worse, but it is a structural, inherent hierarchy of complexity, where each stage coordinates the actions of the preceding stage. So again, when we think about formal thinking, that's sort of the cognitive foundation for what we think of as traditional agricultural society, right? You can have simple if-then relationships, but you find people still tend to stick to linear plans and rules that are determined by others, and they can't necessarily bring all those rules together in a coherent system of thought, right? So if you think about traditional mythic religious belief, there's lots of contradictions. There's lots of rules and if this, then that, but it doesn't always all hang together, right? There are some inconsistencies. There are some contradictions. There are some ways that it's not fully comprehensive, right? Because it's not really systematic yet. If we think about the systematic structure, we're thinking about the foundation of modern science and culture and modernity, right? So we're thinking about liberalism, socialism, and secularism, and how those more systematic ways of thinking kind of swept through society and culture and led to radical changes. And when we're thinking about the meta-systematic thinking, we're thinking about more of postmodernity, right? Being able to critique systems, being able to critique the systems that we've created through industrialization, through modernity, and more both and thinking, right? That's not the end of the trajectory, but if we can at least get more people to that meta-systematic thinking and paradigmatic thinking, we'll be in a much better position to actually respond to the complexity of the systems that we're embedded in. So thinking about education and where people are at and where we need to go, it's really helpful to get a sense of where we're at now, right? So this is some older data, but this is from Robert Keegan, who's also out of Harvard. He has different ways of framing it, but these same basic structures overlap, right? So he has, again, different assessments, different models, different theories, but the overlap is really interesting because what he calls the socialized mind, the self-authoring mind, and the self-transforming mind do broadly overlap with what we think of as traditional, modern, and postmodern society, right? And again, he's framing this notion of the development gap where most people are in over their heads, right? So the name of a great book is In Over Our Heads, which really goes through lots of really great examples of how people in the modern world do not have the capacity and the competence to really respond appropriately to the environments that they're in, whether it be in education or professionally or in politics. We're like always trying to catch up, and we're not really preparing people to be where they need to be to really make sense of it all and make proactive, thoughtful, intelligent decisions. And that's what we need our children to be doing. That's what we need to be doing. And if we're not there yet, we need to reflect on that and continue our own education and our own learning. Because if you look at some data that's been collected, most people are hovering between this socialized and self-authoring stage. So they're starting to disembed themselves maybe from their family, from their society, and they're self-authoring, but they're not really criticizing the systems they're embedded in. They're not really seeing how different systems relate to each other. And they're not really in a more self-transforming space where the perspective that they're taking is actually enabling them to create new categories of meaning, to create new relationships to the environment, to actually make things different than they are, and to take a post-conventional perspective on their social reality. So our children will need to be self-transforming if they're going to be system-transforming, right? And we need genuine individuation and not just modern or postmodern conformism, right? So that's another point that I forgot to mention, which is that a child growing up in a postmodern context can learn the language games of postmodernity and learn to sound like they're really critical of modern society, but they end up in a really cynical, unhealthy place because they haven't themselves necessarily gone through those stages where they're really seeing those things for themselves. They're just actually coming at it from a socialized mind, adapting to a postmodern context. But that doesn't mean that they have a high degree of complexity in their own thinking. So there's a difference between aligning with the sort of cultural codes of your family or your subculture and actually going through the stages of development yourself. So we actually need to be thinking about education in terms of not playing political correctness games, not teaching kids to think a certain way or say certain things or always be thoughtful and sensitive about the words that they use, but actually challenging their thinking every step of the way so that they're doing the internal work to really go through the stages themselves. So that's a crucial difference. What we have happening now is that as this sort of postmodern meta-systematic thinking is becoming more prevalent and more dominant, we see a lot of young kids aligning with it really easily, right? And you could see a lot of this, not to take anything away from it, but in the youth movement toward climate change, it's a great thing. I think it's important. But if you actually did psychological assessments of the millions of kids who are involved, I doubt many of them are really at a self-transforming stage of consciousness, right? They're not really able to think through all the relationships and all the dynamics yet. They're just getting swept up in their current mode of socialization, right? So maybe that's better than what they would have been swept into 100 years ago or 200 years ago. I would argue that it is better, but there's still a crucial difference there. And we need to not let that be good enough and keep challenging our kids to really think through the complexities. We need to be able to have difficult conversations where we're acknowledging different sides of an issue and not just gearing them towards, no, this is the one right way to think about things. Carbon is bad, and everyone should be driving electric cars, and people on that side of the political spectrum are bad, and we're the good guys. That's not complex thinking, right? And that's not the answer for developing more complex thinkers. And that's a crucial thing for postmodern parents to hear, because many of us in this space of even thinking about this are resonating with certain green values, and we want to transmit those values to our children. And that's all well and good, but it's different than thinking through what is actually involved in helping our kids go through that sequence for themselves. So we're going to talk more about that. So just to summarize what I've covered so far, right? We have increasing complexity. We have the emergence of different values, which also transcend and include each other. And we have different cultural codes. So we have this difference between content and structure, where the content of what you think is not necessarily a representation of how complex your structure of thinking is. So we want to be able to untangle that when we're thinking about education. But the main point is that human development is the meta-crisis of our time, right? We have lots of crises happening in the world, but the sort of meta-crisis that's informing it all is, where are we as a culture, as a society, as a species, in terms of our ability to keep responding and adapting and developing. So we need to see the process that's happening, and we need to learn how to change the social games that we're playing. We're only going to be able to do that from at least a metasystematic stage, but probably a paradigmatic stage, and getting beyond some of the cultural traps of postmodernity into whatever a postmodern world would look like. That's what we actually need to be developing right now. Some people are calling it metamodern. Some people are calling it integral. I will talk more about that toward the end too. But it really is about trying to understand the whole spectrum of symbol stages in order to create a society that solves the major problems of modern life, not just critiques modern life, and about seeing everyone and everything as a part of an emergent process of unfolding perspectives, and the seeing relationships between those perspectives and our environments, and how our inner worlds and our outer worlds co-constitute each other, right? Because that is the framework we want to bring to education. We want to be developing environments that support the overall emergence of human consciousness. We don't want to be stuck in limited or limiting structures that sort of arrest our children's development. So let's pick up the narrative about schools and schooling in this context of some of the meta-crises that we're facing as a society, and in this context of human development. So we have plenty to be concerned about when we're looking at how our children are experiencing this complex and complicated world, right? We have completely unprecedented emergence of our relationship to screens and digital technology, which humans before have never had to deal with or think about. When we look at schools, we see a lot of stress. We see standardization. We see emphasis on standardized testing, competition, academic early education. And I would argue that much of this is the legacy of modernity. We're still kind of stuck in fundamentally modernist approaches to education. And we're seeing a lot of tension between modernity and postmodernity sort of fighting in education, but we're not really taking a fully postmodern developmental approach to education yet, which is what we need to move toward. So we need to be thinking about how our social environment is impacting us and our children, and what we can do to protect childhood and to nurture positivity and well-being. Life in the U.S. right now, if it proves anything, it proves that high GDP does not lead to happiness, right? So this whole, again, this sort of modern orientation toward progress and growth, rooted in material growth and economic growth, we are definitely at a point now where we can adequately critique that and be thinking about how to move beyond that. But we're still stuck in it. And our school systems are still stuck in it. And we live in a world where young adults are checking their phone 300 times a day, right? And they're in a social world that they didn't create and they don't know how to make sense of, but they're being swept along in it. So we need to find a way to slow down and think about what we're doing. So it's also important, as we're thinking about this, to think about how some of these larger influences have impacted public education. So in 1983, the Reagan administration put out a document called The Nation at Risk, which was really framed as a wake-up call of how terrible our public education is. And pretty much for the past 40 years, we've been perpetuating this narrative of perpetual crisis. And we've had a nation at risk, we had No Child Left Behind, we've had Race to the Top. And all these sort of top-down approaches to education have really been manifestations of a misguided, and I think at this point anachronistic approach in terms of linear thinking and top-down control, and really influenced by other economic forces like neoliberalism, right? Where you try to use privatization and deregulation as market-based answers to social and political problems. And I see this as sort of a modernist mental virus or a cancerous cultural meme, right? It's a way of approaching the world and approaching social problems that just leads to worse problems and has a lot of collateral damage. And it's founded on some implicit meta-theories that are not often talked about but are really animating a lot of what's happening, right? So you can think of it as reductive human capital theory, which is the idea that the whole purpose of education is to prepare people for the workforce, right? But the way that our public education system was developed in the industrial age, it really was about sorting people and getting people ready to work in factories. And we've as technology has changed and as society has changed, we've still kind of kept the same basic assumptions about what the purpose of education is, and we're shuffling children through our systems in order to prepare them for jobs as though they're just human capital for the marketplace. And all that needs to shift, and it's going to have to because the marketplace is going to shift so much. It would be better if we could get ahead of the curve a little bit and start thinking more deeply about what we're doing. But either way, it's going to have to change. So what we've seen over the past 40 years is this vicious circle of perceived crises and then political reforms to address the crises. And then those reforms often make things worse and exacerbate the problem, which justify the perpetuation of more reforms, right? And what has happened is through that cycle, GDP has continued to go up because there's tons of money being funneled to educational technology and the testing industry, right? So there are perverse incentives, there are perverse economic incentives for a lot of money, taxpayer money, going toward technology and testing as opposed to creating more postmodern or post-postmodern environments for learning, because we just haven't had the right approach. We haven't had the right complexity of thinking to really solve a wicked problem like public education in a country of 300 million people, right? It's a really, I'm not saying it's simple to solve. I'm saying if we have any chance of really making real improvement, it's going to have to be coming from a different perspective and not the perspective that we've seen manifested through our government. So the main drivers of educational policy have not been influenced by what we know about learning and development. We need to be able to see that and critique that so that we can change that. The development of technology and the demands of bureaucracy and the demand for the perpetual increase in economic growth and spending have really been some of the main drivers of what's happening in schools. If you're thinking broadly and nationally, I'm not talking about the level of teachers and classrooms. I'm talking about the water that the teachers are swimming in, right? And the level of classrooms, teachers are trying their best to know as much as they can about children and respond as best as they can to children, but there are many systemic factors involved such that the water that they're all swimming in is just not conducive to actually growth and learning, right? And it's not their fault, and you can't even see it if you're not taking a metasystematic or paradigmatic perspective on society, right? So if our politicians are not taking a metasystematic or paradigmatic perspective on the systems that they are embedded in, how can they responsibly and intelligently adjust and respond to those systems? They can't, and we can see it. They are in over their heads, right? Most people are. So we see this research policy gap where what's happening is not really reflecting what we know about teaching and learning and brain development and human development. But we can't really understand what's happening in education if we don't understand these broader ideological, economic, and historical influences. So what do we know? Let's continue the story and start thinking about what most of you probably thought you were coming to hear about, which is what should we be doing, right? What are some of the things that we should be thinking about when we're thinking about education and child development? But of course, one of the reasons I wanted to cover that context is because if you're asking those questions, what do we know? What should we be doing? What perspective are you asking the question from, right? Are you asking and answering those questions from a traditional perspective, from a modern perspective, from a postmodern perspective, or from an integrated, meta-modern, post-formal, developmentally appropriate, process-oriented framework, right? So part of what I want to argue is that that's the perspective that we need to find a way to inhabit and enact as we even are thinking about these questions. So what we know is that cognitive learning and social emotional learning are both addressed when developmental needs are addressed, right? So when we're looking at the development of the whole person, that's including cognitive development and emotional development. So it's an overly fragmented mistake to separate those things too much. And part of what evolving through more complex perspective means that you're able to differentiate and integrate, right? So you can differentiate things like cognitive learning and social emotional learning, but you have to be able to actually integrate them too and see the educational process as a fundamentally and inherently integrative process where all those things are happening in relationship to each other. So we know that engagement is key, and we know that relationship is critical, right? Nothing is happening in isolation. We're always in relationship. And our children, our species has evolved to be in a crucible of relationship with other people. So those relationships are key. We cannot reduce learning to the input of information or the ability to regurgitate facts, right? There's a more holistic and complex framework for understanding what's happening when we think about learning. We know that children learn from people they love, right? We know that emotion is central to reason, to motivation, to attention, and to memory. If you're going to differentiate those things, you have to find a way to integrate them again. You can't keep them separate. We know that children do not learn from screens or technology the same way that they learn from people, right? That is becoming an established fact when you look at studies they're doing with young children trying to teach them language through technology. They're just not absorbing the information in the same way. You need an embodied relational presence to really activate your brain in the way that our species has evolved to activate our brains. And we know that fear and anxiety cripple learning and neurological functioning. So we have to have safe spaces where kids are secure and securely attached so that they can be free to kind of be online for learning and processing and thinking and not shutting down. So one way of thinking about the learning process, I like this model from Edward Hallowell because it starts with connection, right? And you have to have a community of people who are connected to each other authentically. And then in that connection, people are playing together. And it could just as easily say work. Play and work, there's really no need to make a fundamental distinction between them. It's about being engaged in activities where you're getting feedback from what you're doing. Whether it's play or work kind of depends on how much fun you're having. But either way, you're interacting with the world and other people, and that's how we learn, right? So that's just another way of framing what practice is as we play and work. We're practicing whatever skills it is that we're playing and working on. And through that process, we develop mastery, right? We get better at what we do. It's pretty straightforward. And through that authentic mastery, we get recognition from our community, right? And that recognition deepens our connection, right? So it can be a virtuous circle that is rooted in connection, where you're playing and working and learning and practicing with others. You're getting authentic and meaningful feedback, so you're not doing something that's too hard for you and failing and having people say, oh, good job, like that was great. Because no, like it wasn't great. Maybe you're not doing well and you need that authentic feedback, right? But if the relationships are strong and meaningful and loving, you can actually handle that authentic feedback. You don't need everything to be sugar-coated, right? Children need to be pushed and nudged and not just left to their own devices. So I'll talk about that some more too, because sometimes we want to go to one extreme or the other, either having a really standardized authoritarian telling children what to do, or just letting them play and do what they want all the time. And neither one of those approaches is really holding the dynamic tension that creates the creative friction that development requires, right? So a key point too is that connection is the root of moral behavior and moral development. You cannot didactically teach morals. Telling someone to be good is not an effective teaching method, right? People are good when they genuinely feel connected to other people. They want to do good for them, right? You feel connected to a group and you learn how to be giving and generous and responsive to those people. And then as you get older, that circle can expand, right? And you can start to genuinely care about other people as you develop. But if the connection isn't there and if it's not authentic, no amount of lessons about goodness or morality is going to do much to really help people become moral beings and actually go through the stages of moral development. So that connection and relationship is key, and it needs to be at the center of any educational environment. And mastery, as I sort of pointed out before, mastery is the root of self-esteem, right? Telling someone things about them whether good or bad, is not the way to build up their self-esteem. Children need to be actually successful, which is why developmental appropriateness is so important, right? So as we're thinking about what's developmentally appropriate, we need to be thinking about how we're setting kids up for success to actually experience real success and real progress, where it doesn't matter whether the adult says they're doing good or not. They know whether they're doing good or not. They're experiencing it directly, and they need adults who are going to verify that direct and accurate perception and not go against it, right? So that's really important for parents and teachers too. We want to build our kids up and we want to give them positive feedback. They're already experiencing directly whether they're doing good or not. We need to be attuned enough to actually help them make adjustments so that they can do good in whatever they're doing, whether that means bringing the complexity down a little bit so that they can be successful, or ramping it up a little bit because they're not being challenged, right? So that there's that attunement, and that connection is key. So another aspect that I want to talk about, thinking more about early childhood development, is how important story, narrative, fantasy, myth, and pretend play are, right? So through these activities, they're developing language and their persona. They're being provided with emotional catharsis and emotional processing through different personas. They're developing the building blocks for sequential thinking and abstract thinking, binary structuring, and sort of ordering the world. It's the foundation for making sense of the world, right? We need, that's the level at which we should be having these binaries, is when you're 3, 4, 5 years old. It's okay to think in terms of good and bad when you're 3, 4, and 5, right? It's okay. It's not so okay when you're 35. We should be beyond that. But that doesn't mean we can't let our kids develop these fundamental structures when they're young. And metaphor and imagination are developing those conceptual structures. So pretend play fosters symbolic thought, abstraction, imagination, and interpersonal intelligence, right? Because it's usually in a school context, in the context of relationship and play, and playing with other people, and having to figure out what are the rules, what are the parameters, what's going to have an impact on other people. That kind of free play with other kids is developing that interpersonal intelligence and also that intrapersonal intelligence in terms of figuring out what's going on inside of yourself. So important when we're thinking about, especially the first 5, 6, 7 years of life, to make sure that kids have adequate time and space to really be doing their thing. So there does need to be some element of free play. Not all free play all the time, but it's important to not take it away. I want to talk a little bit too about literacy and technology, because these are big questions and issues for parents of young children especially. So one thing to think about here is the timing of skill development and brain development, right? So knowing how the brain develops is an important thing for education. One thing that's happening in the brain over the early years of life is brain myelination. So myelin is a membrane structure that surrounds the axons in the brain and allows electrical insulation and increases the speed of brain processing and proper functioning of the nervous system. And that's happening in different parts of the brain at different times. So it takes time for different parts of the brain to be myelinated, and that sort of means being activated, being ready, being conducive for really connecting to other parts. And what's going on with reading is that because reading evolved relatively late in our species development, there is not a reading part of the brain, and you're just waiting for that to come online. There's actually different parts of the brain that have to be relating to each other in order for the process of reading to be activated. And that timing is going to be different for every kid. It typically is adequately myelinated by the time they're 7, right? So, and you see this in traditional societies that maybe we're actually more tuned in to their kids, that the sort of natural school age is like 6 or 7 often. Like first grade is really the time to start focusing in on more of those discrete skills in terms of decoding text. Prior to that, some kids it clicks quicker. Great. There's really no long-term benefit to that, though, which is something that it's good for parents to know. There's no long-term benefit for a 3, 4, or 5-year-old to be able to decode text as opposed to just getting it at 6 or 7 or 8. So the research is really clear on that. What there is there are negative social outcomes if natural differences are presented as deficiencies, right? So if you have a group of 5-year-olds, some of them are decoding text and some aren't, and if they're in a social educational environment where somehow that is expressed or perceived or interpreted as some sort of deficiency or problem, then that's affecting their relationships, that's affecting their self-concept, that's affecting their intrapersonal intelligence. So we're doing damage to children who just have natural diversity and are really at no inherent developmental disadvantage, and yet socially we're treating it like it's a problem, we're treating it like it's a disadvantage, we're taking away their playtime to focus on reading when there's no long-term benefit to that, and we're throwing off the sort of natural process of emergence that they're going through over those first 7 years. So that's really, really key. And again, when you take a more modern, linear, sort of quasi-pseudo-rational approach to education, which is what we're all swimming in, and we have this notion of backwards planning where it's like, well, if by 12th grade they need to get this score on their test to go to college, that means by 9th grade they need to be here, and 5th grade they need to be here, and 1st grade they need to be here. Therefore, if all kindergartners are at this benchmark, then they'll be more on pace to graduate and go to Harvard. And that's just not intelligent. It's not complex thinking, right? That's not the way development happens. We are not machines, right? It's not a factory. Children are much more like caterpillars and butterflies than they are things that can be put together on an assembly line, right? So we have to sort of embrace the sort of nonlinear emergent nature and these natural phase shifts that children go through, and get a sense of how that unfolds. So that's crucial, and that's something that we could do a lot better of in schools. So again, oral language is key. Early decoding is not crucial. Actually, a better predictor of long-term success in literacy is invented spelling, right? If young children are actually free to associate and create their own connections between sounds and letters, and they are already feeling like they're writers before they can even read, and they're doing a lot of writing with lots of misspellings, that is a great sign, because they're actually constructing those connections themselves, and they're already developing those habits of mind and those habits of work that actually will carry forward as they get older, because they're learners, they're readers, they're writers. And then when the decoding clicks in and they get past learning to read, then they're reading to learn, but they're engaged and they haven't been shut down and they're ready to take off, right? So we sometimes put things in the wrong order in terms of what's important and what priorities are. So I want to talk a little bit about technology too, because that does relate to literacy. So many of our children are spending their time on screens, sometimes doing activities that supposedly are related to education and learning and literacy, but often are really not that helpful. And we're living in a world where we have to deal with the fact that smartphone addiction is somewhat similar to processed food addiction, right? And the way that our bodies biologically are responding to screens is something that we need to be aware of. So what we're seeing in the world right now is a lot of behavior being driven by neuromodulators, right? Dopamine and serotonin, and the hits that we're getting in our brain every time we click on something and are watching something, that's influencing our behavior. And our unconscious mind is associating with being rewarded every time we do that, right? Every time that we engage a screen, we're rewarding ourselves with dopamine and other neuromodulators, and then that is establishing a feedback loop where we're more likely to keep doing that behavior. That's one way of describing addiction, right? And people talk about neuroplasticity like it's a good thing. I mean, neuroplasticity, brain plasticity is true. Our brains are always developing and adapting and creating new grooves. But whether that's good or bad depends on what you're reinforcing, right? So neuroplasticity and brain plasticity is a really terrible thing and can be a source of pathology. If you're training your brain to be addicted to screens, you're hardwiring your brain in that way. So you have to be thoughtful about what you're actually reinforcing in your behavior. So that habit development and developing healthy relationships to screen-based technology is a crucial thing for our postmodern and post-postmodern parenting world to be thinking about. And to connect the two, thinking about reading online versus reading books, Shallows is a great book that kind of goes through the history and the evolution of reading, and then gets into the difference between what's happening in your brain when you're reading a book versus what's happening in your brain when you're online clicking on stuff. It's two totally different realities in terms of what's happening neurologically. So slow reading leads to long-term memory, right? If you're actually reading a book, you're more likely to store that information in long-term memory. If you're engaged in incessant online media, you're experiencing cognitive overload, and that information is not being stored in your long-term memory as much, especially if you're also not having downtime to not be doing much, like maybe taking a walk in the park where you can actually be processing the information that you just exposed yourself to so that it can be stored in long-term memory. So if it's go, go, go all the time, it's like in one ear, out the other kind of thing. So we're at a pivotal point in our history right now where we are developing what our relationship will be to these screen-based technologies. And we're living in a world where the norm is becoming continuous partial attention, right? Like people, it's getting harder and harder to just be fully present because we are training ourselves not to be fully present. And just to be clear, the research has been clear on this for a while, right? Like the American Academy of Pediatrics recommends 0 screen time for children under the age of 2. And for children 3 to 15, 18, it should be less than 2 hours a day, right? And so and yet we live in a world where the average American spends 8.5 hours a day looking at a screen.
Sorry, and they spend more than 2 hours in a classroom.
On a screen.
Right.
Yeah.
After school to watch TV.
Yeah, it's problematic. It's problematic, to say the least. No, it's huge. We need to be thinking about it. And as kids get older, of course, that screen time, it depends what you're doing. So not all screen time is equal. You can be writing. I mean, right now, like writing is going to be taking place on a screen once you get older. But a lot of informational technologies are framed as educational technologies, especially for young children, and they're just not. So my focus really when I'm thinking about this is young children, and there's really not much of a benefit and a big downside for children under the age of 10 to be using screens. And the popular justifications for that are actually pretty silly when you think about it. Like we have these narratives that we're preparing our children for the future, but the apps that they're using on their iPad are not relevant to what they're going to be doing as 20 and 30-year-olds. We don't even know what technology they're going to have access to, right? It's just a really bad argument. And also, it is great that we have, in some ways, we can outsource our memory to technology, so we have access to information. But what is determining how we're using that technology? What is determining what we're using Google for is the process of education that we've gone through, and the amount of knowledge that we actually have in our long-term memory is going to impact who we are and our self-concept and the things that we're interested in and the things we're even going to use technology for. So we need to be focused on how we develop minds who are going to use technology in pro-social ways, as opposed to linking people up with technology, which is just going to lead to sort of undeveloped ways of using it, right? So the focus, again, should be on human development. I'm going to try to get through what I can here, and then I would love to stay as late as people want to answer questions. So again, just thinking about this technology piece more, and also one thing that's really prevalent in our society is this metaphor of like the brain in a computer, and I want to actually take some time to unpack that, because the mind-brain interface is much more like a complex ecosystem than it is like a machine, right? So a computer is a complicated machine, but it is not a complex system, right? It's not growing, changing, adapting. It's not in relationship to its environment, but people are, right? So if you think of children or brains like a computer, then you're thinking of them as passive and programmable, right? But they're not. They're active and they're autonomously growing. If you're thinking of us as computers or machines, you're thinking of us as though variability and diversity is a problem to be fixed, right? But it's not. Variability in children should be expected and is the result of dynamic growth and organization. If you're thinking about quality in terms of a single metric like IQ, you've really missed the mark, because the quality of someone's mind can be represented in various different ways. So you can't reduce it in the way that you can reduce a machine. And if schools are like computer factories or repair shops, and students are designed and repaired based on set standards, that's a very different model of education than if schools are like conservation areas to protect an ecosystem, right? So I think the model of a complex ecosystem is actually much more empowering and much more research-based, so we don't want to kind of reduce what we are to the technology that we're interacting with. It's almost like we're starting to think of ourselves more like computers now that we're becoming addicted to using computers. So we need to kind of break free of that. And another piece to mention is that technology cannot replace teachers, right? Technology and screens can replace books and chalkboards, maybe, but not human beings. And we're almost thinking about technology as though we won't need the human relationships anymore that education is all about, and we need to just fundamentally not fall into that trap and put technology in its place. Yes, we can get rid of textbooks and chalkboards maybe, and we can have more digital ways of interfacing with information. But the context of human relationships is not something that can be changed without fundamentally altering our developmental process, right? So there is this evolutionary mismatch between our brain and our species and modern society, and we need to start thinking about what we need to do to be healthy, right? Nature nurtures, and kids need downtime, right? And more time in nature leads to a decrease in depression and anxiety, an increase in concentration and creativity and memory. Time in nature enables the ecosystem of your mind and brain to actually attune to and become resonant with and integrated with the ecosystem of the earth. And if we're going to be having people raising children who are going to take care of the earth, they need to have an actual connection to the earth and experiencing themselves as biological beings that actually depend on an ecosystem to literally keep them alive. And we're so disconnected, it's like we don't even think of ourselves as animals anymore. We are animals who literally ground to the earth through electromagnetic energy in our bodies, right? Like there's a lot of research being done on what our physical connection is to the earth and how we are part of this broader ecosystem. We are a complex system embedded in other overlapping complex systems, and that's the kind of framework that we need to have if we're really going to grok how to have a better relationship to our environment. So again, time in nature enables an increase in cognitive control, which enables higher emotions. Empathy and higher emotions require a calm, attentive mind that can be present with somebody else and not distracted. We need downtime to process long-term memory, as I mentioned. And we need to see and critique and liberate ourselves from the perverse incentives that are behind our orientation toward having a more materialist and standardized and sort of modern approach to education, right? Like thinking about ADHD is a good example, because we've framed it as a medical problem, and we're sort of trying to reduce what's happening to a problem in the brain. So we're actually framing academic underperformance as a medical condition to be treated with drugs that we know have negative long-term effects, right? And if we see it in that framework, we're missing the social context of it all. We're missing how the emergence of the behavior and the way we're interpreting the behavior are happening in a social context, right? And we need to think about the context and the environment that that's happening in, and not just have a pathological interpretation of difference and diversity. So to just hammer the point home, especially for young children, earlier is not better. We need to actually give our kids time and space to explore, create, and play. And the dichotomy between academics and social emotional learning is a false dichotomy. We need to be able to reintegrate that differentiation. Overall cognitive development is rooted in relationship to one's environment. Mental health aligns with the joys of childhood. Again, we don't have to make hard choices there. Actually, the things that are going to make childhood more joyful and more happy are also the things that will lead them on the path of their own development to be ready to be developing those more complex structures as they get older. So overall, long-term development is not helped by rushing it in the early years. I think that's a crucial point. So this is sort of what I had in mind at the beginning when I thought about educational simplicity, and it really kind of boiling down to love and play. And research on child development and social neuroscience and interpersonal neurobiology, they really boil down to love and play, and that fosters all lines of development. But the complication is that loving your children is not the same as them feeling loved, right? And all parents love their children, but not all children are securely attached. And secure attachment is actually potentially the most important factor in human development. So children need to be securely attached to their caregivers. They need to feel safe, to be comforted, so that they can process emotions, so that they can explore and create and learn and change. And that needs to be carried over not just in terms of what's happening in the first few years with parents, but when we're thinking about early childhood, it needs to be carried over into how we're thinking about early childhood education. Children and teachers at that young age need to also have the same dynamic of secure attachment, where teachers can be an emotional, supportive comfort and not just somebody who's trying to put content into the child's brain. right? So there's a difference between just loving children and actually doing what's necessary to actually help them develop secure attachment so they can be in a place to keep changing and evolving as they get older. And similarly with play, right? We don't want to fall into the simple idea, well, oh, just let kids do whatever they want all the time and let them play all the time. That can be framed as sort of a cognitive maturity fallacy, where we think that they are mature enough to make all their own decisions about what they should be doing. And that's not the case at all, right? Children need guidance, and children need adults who are adults and are attuned to them and are in right relationship with them and know what they need as an individual on their next step. So it's not just all play all the time, right? Malcolm Gladwell in his book Outliers talks about this notion of concerted cultivation and how you see these really disparate parenting styles where some parents are just really hands-off and let their kids do whatever they want, and other parents are much more hands-on and engaged. And so he makes this distinction between positive entitlement and negative entitlement. So entitlement is a problem if we're sort of not holding the natural hierarchy between adults and children and letting kids sort of be entitled to think that they can do whatever they want all the time. That's not healthy. But we actually want to cultivate a sort of positive entitlement where they are learning to interface with the world. They're learning that they are autonomous actors who are unique and independent from their parents and their teachers, who have their own ideas, who are listened to, and who are engaged in relationships where they're taken seriously and they're allowed to just be their own person and really getting authentic, responsive feedback from adults and from their environment to sort of help them on their way, right? So it's really trying to find that middle path in terms of control versus free play. It doesn't need to be either extreme. So when we're thinking about schools, what are the things that we should be looking for to kind of bring together some of the things that we should be that we've been talking about? We want schools that have a holistic view of development, right, and respect neurodiversity, respect natural diversity, not treat difference as a deficiency. We want schools that really honor the sacred individuality of each child. Standardization is one of the biggest problems that we face, and thinking that there's set benchmarks as though every child at a certain age should be doing the same thing at the same time. It just doesn't make any sense, and it will never happen. All you're doing is giving some kids really unnecessary negative feedback and having other kids think that just because they're just naturally decoding faster or whatever, that they're the smart ones. And it's actually destructive on both ends of that spectrum. So we just don't want to fall into that. We want to respect each child as an individual and have relationships where we can be attuned enough to them to give them what they need as individuals in the context of a secure and loving group. Which leads us to thinking about tribal classrooms. The reason we call them tribal classrooms is because we're connecting to our evolutionary history, right? We're connecting to the fact that throughout time, people have been raised in multi-age groups with multiple adults who care for them, children of different ages. Everyone has strengths and weaknesses. Everyone is an individual, but there are deep bonds. There's deep trust and meaningful relationships, right? So we want, ideally, a school will be an extension of that, an extension of the family, and a place where the relationships are real and deep and trusting, and children are not overly standardized and not just stuck with kids of their own age, but to have interactions across ages where sometimes they're the leader and maybe the older one, sometimes they're the younger one and they're learning from older kids. So there's a real developmental logic to multi-age classrooms, or at least fostering relationships across ages, and not just having a dynamic where it's like one adult telling all the little people what to do, but something just more collaborative and more a context for emergence where ideas can emerge from the group, right? And ideas and insights and learning can emerge from the relationships of that group and not just a transmission of knowledge from the adult to the children. So that goes hand in hand with developmental timing and having a sense of what's developmentally appropriate and being responsive to not rushing kids, but also not letting kids fall behind. And a post-conventional culture might be one of the most important things. What I mean by that is more what I was talking about in terms of, getting beyond the norms of modern society and postmodern society and kind of the way that things are, but really helping children orient themselves to the world so that their orientation is to make the world a better place, as opposed to simply being successful in the world as it is, right? The underlying sort of assumption of a lot of educational context is that we're preparing children to be successful in the world. And what I'm arguing is that that is a mistaken and an anachronistic goal, right? We need to be helping our children be oriented to the world so that they are prepared to make the world better and to transform the world, because the way that things are now are about to break down, and it's not going to continue the way it is. We need them to actually be oriented toward the good and not just towards some conventional notion of success, but actually being post-conventional, being able to criticize and reflect on the way that things are so they can keep the evolutionary process moving forward. And we need schools that nurture that complexity and do not succumb to reductionism in any of these ways. So as adults, what I'm getting to, and just to kind of cycle back and review a little bit, getting us to reflect on our values that relate to education in light of what we know about a broader context of evolutionary and developmental unfolding, right? So modern values are not necessarily bad or wrong, but they are now inadequate for our context in a postmodern leading to a post-postmodern world. And we need to remember that when we're thinking about how success is framed in schools and society, that the social, cultural, economic, and climate crises all continue to be perpetuated by the graduates of our top universities, right? Something is off there. And economic crashes are in part the result of greed and incompetence of our best test takers, right? So getting good grades, going to a good college should not be the goal of parenting or education. That's actually part of the problem. And we need to see that really clearly so that we can help our kids see that really clearly, so that by the time they're getting through high school, they can actually already be developing post-conventional values and a post-conventional relationship to the world, so that they're oriented to their own sacred individuality and what their own path is for making the world a better place, right? More people trying to be successful is only going to exacerbate the big wicked problems that we talked about at the beginning. And the sort of foundations of meritocracy and individualism remain the default meta theory for much of education in modern society. So that's why we need to be looking at that and thinking about that and reflecting on that, and not just unconsciously perpetuating that. Because it's just no longer good enough to be looking through those modern values at the world. And it's also, to sort of raise the stakes even more, it's no longer good enough either to just critique and criticize, right? We can't just be postmodern critics who are frustrated with modernity and capitalism. We have to actually try to reconstruct a postmodern society based on research-based principles and beyond partisan polarities and binaries, right? So the answers of either political binary right now are not adequate to the complexity that's needed to bring to these social problems. So as we move toward more growth-oriented, process-oriented social ideals, we're embracing the whole process at every stage, where every stage is seen as whole and complete in itself. Children are not just inadequate adults. Like, really engaging everyone where they're at, whatever their age, is crucial to kind of help them on their path, because we're all ultimately on this path of development and we're all going to be in different places. And actually seeing it developmentally can lead to more empathy, not more judgment, right? It's not about judging people about where they're at on the path. It's about seeing that we're all on the path and attuning to each other enough so that we can help each other get to whatever the next stage is for us. So we're just seeing this developmental context also enables us as parents to acknowledge the sort of spiritual practice of parenting, right? And see that we are still on the path. It's not just about us transmitting our values and our knowledge to our children. It's about actually continuing our own growth through the relationships that we have with our children. And parenting can be one of the biggest instigators of adult development, right? Because we're challenged and we're pushed in ways that we did not anticipate, and we have to get more metacognitive and more reflective about what we're doing and what we're thinking and what we're transmitting to our children. And that can be an impetus for ongoing growth, and we all need to be engaged in that process, especially when we see the sort of spectrum of what's possible for adults. Hopefully it helps us all realize that if we've been stuck in the same way of thinking for the past 10 years or 20 years, we're experiencing arrested development, right? And we need to think about what do we need to be doing to continue to update our thinking and our value structures as well. So there's a way in which an analogy can be made where we see with children really clearly that they experience their emotions, but they can't necessarily separate from them or objectify them and see them. They're just in it, right? Which is why we get so many tantrums. It's hard for them to have that metacognitive distance between how they identify and their experience. But as adults, we can develop that metacognition about emotions and about our values, right? So instead of being fused with the structure of values or a way of thinking, we can reflect on and increase the complexity of those values and those cognitive structures. So moving forward, thinking again sort of more socially, what would be the new ideas that we need for our society to even be thinking about how to be good and do good in a sort of meta-modern world, right? We see this progression through history of, our circle of care and compassion can expand from the self to the group to the world. The complexity of our thinking can expand from being sort of pre-conventional to conventional to post-conventional. We can go from having a sort of naive, objective sense of like, well, our view is in tune with objective reality, to then seeing that there is this like this subjectivity and multi-perspectives, to then realizing that you can be construct aware and context aware in your own thinking. So there's all these different sort of movements that we are going through as adults, and there's a lot of great people out in the world. These books are some examples of people who are trying to fit these pieces together to think about what the future needs to look like if we're going to actually solve the problems of modernity that we've been talking about. And one interesting thing to note is that in this context of human development, when you look at what actually constitutes how people show up and relate to each other as they get into these more complex stages, you realize that part of it is, as I said, becoming construct aware, meaning aware that you are constructing reality through your mind and it's not objective. And context aware, meaning you're aware of how the context of your environment has shaped that construction. And once you realize that, the way you engage with other people can fundamentally shift, right? Because it's less about having strategic communication where I have this view and it's the objective truth, and then I need to communicate that to other people to convince them or win an argument or sort of be right. And actually you can open up into a more non-strategic communication where you're actually interested in how the different perspectives of a group can lead to new emergent ideas. And engaging reality in that way is what we need at every level of society. We need that to be the heart of the educational process, where people are engaging together not just to transmit pre-established facts or truths, but to actually think about things together and to see how the different perspectives in that room can lead to new insights and new ideas, so that everyone's thinking is being improved through relationship, right? And what if we actually engage the political process in that way, where instead of people thinking that they have the objective answer and fighting with people on the other side of the aisle about what the objective answer is, it's actually a process-oriented situation where people are coming together to figure out how to respond to something, openly acknowledging that they can't possibly have the answers yet, right? It's a more mature way of approaching social reality and social problems and the world at large and education. So those are the kinds of values that we need to wake up to and inhabit, more process-oriented, undetermined values, right? Where you don't have to know all the answers ahead of time. There is no predetermined truth or answer to any of the wicked problems that we're trying to solve. It hasn't been figured out yet, partly because we're not engaging the problems with the right degree of complexity and humility. And it's not just about, at the same time, it's not just about individuals getting more and more complex to be more and more and more and more and more so that they can outcompete other people and so that they can win the game, right? That's also not a trap we want to fall into. It's about learning to be more present, less strategic, more empathetic, less individualistic, and less competitive in our approach to life so that we can actually change the social game that we're all playing with each other. All these books are great. I want to especially recommend The Listening Society for someone who's unpacking this notion of what a meta-modern world would look like if we actually were solving the problems of modernity, and it's rooted in a developmental understanding of individuals and collectives. But all the books that I put up here, I've put up there because I'm recommending them. So, to bring this to a close, just to offer a final reflection on what we can do as individuals and in the small social worlds that we inhabit. I want to talk a little bit about, well, first of all, just to summarize, there's this approach to education and parenting that's rooted in play and rooted in understanding development, where we're prioritizing connection and fun, and we're maximizing nature and relationships. And then I want to talk a little bit about what we can do individually as adults in terms of first-person practices, meaning how we're developing ourselves, Second person practices would be how you're relating to other people. And third person practices would be how you're relating to the world and engaging in the world. And just to take a pause to talk a little bit about individually, it's cool to see how meditation and mindfulness are becoming more known and more practiced, and we're really just skimming the surface in terms of what's possible for utilizing the cultivation of our intrapersonal intelligence through extended periods of silence. And meditation is really the best way that we know to facilitate structural change cognitively, right? Because we're in this interesting dilemma. I've talked a lot about evolution and human development and these different stages, and there's a way in which it's all just kind of happening, right? It's just happening naturally, and we're along for the ride, and we can kind of look at it and appreciate it. And then there's these different elements of how do you create an environment for children that fosters that development. But what we see from the research is that as an adult, it's actually really hard to fundamentally shift your perspective. Like usually by the time we get to our 20s, we've kind of landed on a plateau of cognitive complexity and a pretty well-established value structure. And we see that between the ages of 20 and 60, 70, not much growth typically happens for adults. If you're going to actually continue to evolve as an adult, you have to do it consciously, and you have to actually engage your willpower in a new way. So having a model of human development as a sort of background operating system really helps to motivate one to do that work, because it's not necessarily easy. I say this as someone who has spent thousands and thousands of hours just sitting and doing nothing. But that's kind of why I'm here today, because I'm working through these processes myself and have come to learn about how when you do that and when you slow down and you actually pay attention to what's happening inside of you, one way of thinking about it is you're recapitulating the process of evolution itself, because one way of describing human development is what was your subjectivity becomes something that you can see and objectify, right? So then therefore you are taking a broader perspective inherently. If you can look at your own thinking, you're no longer fused with it. You're taking a broader view. So what's that view, right? And it just keeps going back. If you just stay with that process and you keep expanding outward to actually not identifying with anything that arises, any thought, any way of thinking, any persona or identity or individuality, if you can actually just observe it and see it as something that's arising in your experience, your experience of awareness becomes more open and more broad and less constrained and less contracted and less confined to a certain structure, right? Because you'll observe that most of your thoughts will resonate with a certain frequency, right? You're either having lots of sort of traditional formal thoughts, or maybe you're having more like modernist linear thinking, systematic kinds of thoughts, or maybe the kind of thoughts that you have resonate more with the metasystematic frequency. But either way, they're just thoughts coming and going. They're not actually who you are, right? You ultimately are that awareness within which that is arising. And the more that you can see your experience in that sort of process-oriented way, the more you can also see the experience of other people in that process-oriented way, and just realize that we're all just kind of tuning into different frequencies and mistaking it as our identity, but that's not inherently necessary. So for us as adults, if we're going to get to the furthest stages where we're actually able to be more present and more aware with our children, we actually have to engage some of these practices at some level, or we're just going to be operating on default mode, and you're just going to be interpreting everything that I'm saying from whatever structure that you're already established in, right? So, and that's what we all have to do inherently. We're taking information in, and we're interpreting it, we're constructing it in a structure of sense-making, right? But this is about engaging that process in a way where the structure of your sense-making actually is open and diaphanous and can change and grow and expand. So I guess I will leave it there. If you want to be in touch with me, you can find me on Facebook or Twitter. I'm not really on Twitter, but I do post things to there, like when I come across an article or a video or something that I think is relevant and meaningful, I'll just post it. And if you want to see more about what I'm working on or what I'm doing, you can find me on Patreon. You can support me there if you want to. And I realized that was not a short story. That was a pretty long story. But we need new stories. We need empowering stories for our children to really understand the story of the world and the story of their life. And I'm hoping that more and more parents will join me in trying to convey to the next generations an empowering and enlightening story of what humanity is all about and why we're here, and sort of what our responsibilities are to each other and to the planet. So I'd be happy to answer any questions or just think with you about some things if you have any lingering interests. Thank you.
Yeah, this is really, really fascinating. Thank you. I'm concerned about options for young people after they leave, say, like a Carolina Friends school. I think a lot of the options above there are shutting down. I know that Hampshire College is perhaps shutting down, or Madison is maybe shutting down. So if you develop these open ways of thinking, and then you don't offer a lot of places where they can continue, what do you do?
Yeah, it's a real problem. I mean, that's why I'm here trying to get some people to get on the bus with me and create those environments. I don't know. We as adults, the more of us that can kind of see what's needed to really help children continue on their path of growth, to create environments like that, whether it be a university or just a job setting, like whatever your job is it an environment where people are going to grow, right? There's a Robert Keegan, in addition to doing work around individual development, has also been doing work with organizations, and this notion of having a deliberately developmental organization. And I'd like to expand that idea in terms of having a deliberately developmental school, deliberately developmental society. Like every structure should be deliberately developmental, meaning we're always engaging the work of that context in a way that's going to facilitate the growth of other people. So what you're really asking for me to reframe it is, how do we make more context deliberately developmental, right? How do we make schools, organizations, businesses, actually places that will be healthy and conducive to growth? And right now that's not happening, partly because we don't have enough people who are operating from a place where they really see that as a need, and they even see what's possible. And one thing I didn't mention, I mean, there's so much to unpack here. Another distinction that can be made is, as we're thinking about these structures that have emerged, and all the structures that have emerged up to what I've been calling postmodernity, whether they're, pre-modern, traditional, modern, postmodern, some frameworks see all of those as having a similarity in that they don't see the whole thing, right? None of those perspectives are able to really see development itself. They're too in a particular view. And what happens beyond that sort of metasystematic postmodern structure is that's when the process itself starts to come online, and you start to actually become aware of the process itself, aware of yourself as a developing being. So that can be thought of as a sort of second tier. Like all the stages that open up beyond that have that in common. What they have in common is they see this big picture of unfolding. They see that there is some reality here, that what I'm saying is not a made-up story. There actually is this reality of unfolding evolutionary emergence, and all the stages that open up beyond that metasystematic level at least have the potential to really understand that, whereas some theorists would argue prior to that, you actually do not have the capacity to see it. It doesn't matter if I'm in conversation with you and I'm telling you all about it, you're just going to reframe it in whatever way makes sense to you, and you're not really going to see it. So it's important for people on that cusp, that sort of self-authoring, self-transformative and beyond, like people who are actually at a point where they're already, maybe they're green, maybe they're postmodern, maybe they're metasystematic, maybe they're critical of things, maybe they are more likely to resonate with what I'm saying and have some aha moments where then they can be someone who would be more likely to create a growth conducive environment. So it's sort of both. You need access to the information, like having, there's a great quote that there's nothing as practical as a good theory. Like actually the theory is important. I feel that the reason I'm here, for people to be exposed to this information is really important, because if you are ready and ripe to actually make sense in this developmental way, you still need to be exposed to it to actually be empowered to do so. But also, if you're not at the point where you're going to be ready to really absorb it and move forward with it, then that's when doing other practices to sort of facilitate your own growth come in. So I think sharing these frameworks and these theories is important, and getting beyond this notion of sort of developmental blindness, where we tend to not really acknowledge human development in the social world, even though it helps explain so much. Making this more common knowledge, I think, will be helpful. And you can also see over time that these percentages are starting to shift, right? And there's another body of research that's really looking at this question of what percentage of people do you need operating from a certain structure to really have a big impact in a broader way. And what they have found throughout history is that it doesn't take a majority of people. It might take closer to something like 10% of people, right? Like when you're thinking about something like the European Enlightenment and like the scientific revolution, you're not talking about the majority of people like being secular, modernist, like rational thinkers, right? You're talking about a pretty small group of people who are able to exert a lot of power and influence. You can see that as well with the postmodern revolution. We're still not at a place where the majority of society is kind of thinking from this sort of green postmodern perspective, but it's permeating our social reality. Because once you get to that 10+%, because there are some inherent and fundamental ways that it actually is more complex, and there is a sort of natural hierarchy there, it starts to have a big influence. And it seems like you just can't avoid that. So the hope for a lot of these theorists is that as more sort of second-tier, integral, postmodern thinking starts to show up, it'll start having reverberating effects on society, even if the majority of people are not necessarily initiating that themselves. So that's my hope. Mm-hmm. It's too much, I know. Sorry, but I don't know what else to do. Thank you all. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I was just going to ask a more practical question. What kind of advice do you have for parents of young kids who are trying to make decisions on where to live and what schools to have available? And
Yeah.
these ideas in mind.
Yeah.
How do you do these assessments on most of these instances, or like end of your grade tests?
Yeah.
Or rankings, like this is the best public school in the state. How do you find these values?
Yeah. I mean, a lot of people are trying different things who are kind of waking up to this. So you can see that there's a big increase in like homeschooling and like free-range parenting, and people trying to fight against the conventional norms. For myself, I've answered that question by kind of falling into really forward-thinking private schools and having to deal with that tension between wanting to support public education. I actually worked in public schools for a while. I'm a product of public schooling myself, was open to my daughter going to public schools. I want to be a part of transforming public education to be more research-based. But at this point in time, at that level of like your own individual experience, the overall dynamics that are influencing those systems are not postmodern and are not growth-oriented. That for me, and even being of actually very limited financial means, was very lucky to get scholarship to independent school that I resonated with, and trying to find a subculture that's resonating philosophically. And as a professional, I made that change too, where I was working in public schools and trying to fight that good fight of moving it in a more research-based direction, but found so much resistance and so little resonance that to me it just didn't feel like the best use of my energy. But different people will have to answer that question differently, because we need people engaged in public education who are trying to move it in that direction. We also need parents to be clear on these issues enough, and clear on some of the principles that I was trying to point out enough, that they can exert some healthy pressure on schools to let schools know that parents don't want their children in an environment that's all about standardization and testing, and to try to move that cultural sort of milieu like in the right direction. And that happens through conversation. It happens through questioning and challenging the status quo. It comes through supporting teachers as opposed to supporting the Secretary of Education, who's like totally regressive and misaligned. I mean, the talk that I gave on Monday was even more about society and really getting into some of the dynamics of what's going on politically. And you can really see it as there's lots of regressive tendencies. Like evolution is certainly not a linear clean like growth to goodness process. Like there's all kinds of regressions and fallbacks and reactions and resistance to what's happening, even though these larger trajectories can be discerned. The health of our public education system right now is not up to pace, so I don't know. We need people to be in public schools trying to shift it. We also need to give everyone the right to kind of opt out, whether that means homeschooling or finding an independent school that resonates more. Everyone's going to be in a different social situation and have different positionality in terms of economics and location. For me, the reason I'm literally like in Chapel Hill, North Carolina right now is because I came here to be at Carolina Friends School, and I found that Quaker education was a way to really integrate spirituality, silence, and postmodern, moving toward postmodern social values. And I wanted to find an environment that I could help move that conversation even further and not get mired in a sort of green postmodernity, but actually try to move that conversation forward. So it's going to be different for everyone. Yeah. And I would say that, and this is something I find myself telling parents a lot, because part of my job is welcoming families to my school. People apply to the school. I meet families to talk about how wonderful our school is, but also trying to hold that tension of knowing that like your kid can be fine anywhere. Like we also don't want to over emphasize or exaggerate that like we need this perfect environment for our kid, because it's like challenge is good too, struggle is good too. I mean, there's pros and cons, and the sort of public-private dilemma is a real dilemma, because it's not like it's all good versus all bad. Like there are real downsides to being in like a private school bubble, and it just brings up different challenges and different questions of how do you do that in a way that's oriented towards social justice and equity and having a bigger impact on the world and being ready to engage in different spheres of life. Whereas the challenges in public school are more about how do you protect childhood, how do you align it with developmental appropriateness. So there's different challenges in every context. So it's about being responsive to your child and attuned to your child, and whatever context they're in, helping them navigate it. And I think that's the most important thing, and that relationship and that co-navigation of social reality is so much more important than what the demographics of that social reality are. So I would emphasize that.
I came in a little late, so forgive me if my question has already been answered or if you've already covered this. I actually went to Friends School in Baltimore a long, long time ago.
Yeah.
In the early 80s. But I'm studying now to be a school counselor at UNC in Charlotte. And a lot of your ideas sort of echo the ASCA model for school counselors, Association for School Counselors.
Mm-hmm.
And I was just wondering, I know this is parenting focused, but I was wondering what your ideas are for school counselors, what their role would be in relation to your ideas here. Because I like your ideas, and it really echoes the advocacy part of the school counseling model.
I would hope that school counselors, you're talking about at like high school level?
Actually, I'm
lower.
For elementary school.
Elementary.
Which is when the minds are malleable.
Yeah.
For a better word.
Yeah.
They're really open to when I'm doing my internship now at Woods Creek. They have restorative circles.
Yeah.
If there's an issue that comes up on the bus or something, they'll have a circle and they'll all talk about it.
Yeah.
They'll all, you see these little hands raised and I felt this way. It's
Yeah.
amazing. It's incredible.
Yeah, no, it's great. That's an important role. And a lot of these ideas that are supportive of overall development are finding their ways into schools, for sure. And it's my experience working in public and charter schools is that you have a lot of really thoughtful people doing the good work, trying to bring structures like that in, and those adults are constantly fighting against the limits of the bureaucracy that they're engaged in. So if you're in a role like that, it's so important to be an advocate for development in the appropriate practice, for social emotional learning, for trying to keep the balance as much as you can in terms of if you're in an environment that is overly standardized, overly academic, overly like disembodied, to advocate for that in whatever way you can, whether it's in your direct relationship with children, in your relationships with teachers, in your pushback against administrators, trying to really help make sure that your institution is infused with research-based practices, right? And bringing in concrete ideas like restorative justice circles and things like that. So that's crucial. And then for counselors working with older children, I think it's really important to also be that bridge for helping people understand the breadth of the social world that lays in front of them. And it's not just about being on a narrow track of like test scores and colleges and then not knowing what you want to do in the world and getting a job to make money, but really having those more difficult conversations with young people about what are they doing? What are they thinking? Why are they here? What do they want to do? Who are they? Yeah, and not letting them just reduce their options and reduce the frameworks within which they're understanding their potential, their possibility, but really trying to expand those conversations as much as possible to get teenagers thinking about themselves in a broader context, right?
I hear, your struggle is in public schools. It's really hard.
Yeah.
To make those questions. And it is, frankly, when the, economic situation is a bit different, in inner city schools, and I went to private schools my whole life, so what am I talking about? But I've seen, a lot of schools where they really struggle.
Yeah.
It's kind of easier to, contemplate your navel when your belly's full.
Yeah.
And not to be disrespectful, I'm sorry.
No, those are the schools that I grew up in, and those are the schools that I worked in, was urban public schools. Mm-hmm. Yeah, but we're also seeing great success stories in all different social contexts of bringing mindfulness and meditation into schools, and it's actually often the lowest income schools where you're seeing the most tremendous impact of programs like that. I've worked with people out in like Oakland who are doing that. So bringing those structures and programs and processes in to every kind of school. It's kind of built in to the system at a Quaker school, but it can go anywhere. And that's the thing that's so beautiful about these larger stories and these bigger pictures, is that they are universal in this way. Like meditation and silence is something that's as universal as play, regardless of your positionality or your income or your demographic or where you live, right? So we need to find these more universal touch points that we can all kind of tap into.